Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library. One such scholar joins me today. Stefka Hristova is Associate Professor at Michigan Technological University. Stefka, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. It's a pleasure to be able to join the podcast and talk a little bit about my research and experience at the Hagley.
Oh, great. Well, let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching and working on at the moment?
I'm working on a book-length project about the importance of photographic negatives in understanding not only the history of the medium, but also the ways in which we engage with AI technologies in the current landscape.
Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit?
Absolutely. So when we think about photography, and Jeffrey Butchin, who's a scholar of photography, has noted that we often think about photography in its positive forms. We encounter photography in its positive form. And the negative form, which is kind of the opposite of the positive, it's the image that you get from first shooting on film or using other photographic techniques that have doubling as its core, has been neglected. We don't necessarily know how to read those forms of media, and we don't necessarily encounter them often. And we seem to think of photography as positive only media, which is, I think, problematic. What we gain by thinking about the negative and the importance of negative in establishing, especially the documentary or truth value of the image, is that we can start to understand algorithmic media in a positive and negative relationship too. And in my work, I call on the idea of the algorithmic negative, which is kind of a way to think about, in this case, data sets or other entries that kind of provide the raw material out of which you have a positive algorithmic image. But again, this idea of a positive negative media structure is central, and it's reliant upon understanding the positive negative relationship of photography, because the positive negative relationship of photography has been foundational not only for visual but sound media, and by extension for algorithmic media, which is why when I came to the Hagley, I looked at the negative collection connected to RCA's recording studio, and it's in the negatives collection that you get the richness about the processes of recording not only visual but sound information as well.
Well, how do you go about reading a negative image, and how does that differ from the positive?
It requires, I think, a little bit of ability to look at the inverse. It requires a specific, I guess, technology. You have to have a light box in order to be able to see the image, and often a magnifying glass is your best friend in order to be able to see the details. But just training your eye to be able to perceive the opposite of the image and to kind of make sense of it, I think is central. And understanding the processes from which this original negative image, because it is the original image, becomes the source for the multiple positive images that are then produced through darkroom processes or other forms of inversion, whether digital or analog. So understanding the distinction between the two and the processes requires a little bit of kind of practice and an understanding of process, and also some technological kind of augmentation in terms of having a backlight, having a magnifying glass, and kind of knowing what you're looking for in these processes.
What is the historical period you're looking at in terms of the source of these negatives?
I'm interested in the 1930s, late 1930s and early 1940s, around the time where the word documentary emerges in relations to documents, right? So we have this longer trajectory of history about which Gilman writes about, like the emergence of the paper as a document. And in the 1930s, with the Federal Security Administration, we have the emergence of documentary as genre, and especially in relations to both sound and visual, right? We have photographers documenting rural life in America, and also sociologists bringing recording equipment to capture the sounds, not just the sights of this particular moment. So I'm interested in the emergent technology, but also the ways in which that technology becomes itself documented, and how it deals with questions of manipulation, which, as we know, becomes kind of prevalent around the 1930s and 40s with the documentary genre of both sound and image.
I suppose that brings up a really key concept that you mentioned earlier, and that's truth value,
Yes.
in terms of the ability of a documentary or collection of media to convey something real about the world. Could you perhaps unpack that concept and explain why it's important to your study?
Thank you. Truth value is really an important aspect of the idea of a document. And we often, when we look at the positive, whether it's a sound recording like that came out of the matrix or a positive photograph, the truth value usually was endowed to that particular piece of information in the past because we didn't have access to the negatives that produced the matrix, right? The original out of which this positive image emerges. But it's central to be able to understand and read the negatives because the positive often hides traits of manipulation. So in the Hagley, what brought me there was an image of an engineer manipulating the matrix, changing the matrix out of which the positive sound collection will be emerging. And that was captured in the negative. So you can see the image which was capturing this moment of manipulation, but also the image itself had little fingerprints on it from being handled. There was black tape that was positioned in order to isolate parts of the image, right, where the image itself has been kind of changed. And in photography, manipulation emerges as soon as the photographic image comes about. And Mia Feynman writes about that in her wonderful book, Faking It. Right, we have this image from 1853 of a monk, four monks on the rooftop in Malta. And when you look at the negative, one of them has been blacked out. So it's interesting when you look at the negatives, a lot of that editing as well as a lot of that human trace and process trace is still left in the image, whether it's by chemical smudges, fingerprint smudges, or write out blackout of areas that were deemed not relevant, maybe, or distracting, right? But the doctoring processes are revealed when you look at the negative. The positive will only give you a partial story. And I just want to throw in an anecdote that you might find interesting,
Oh,
or the
please.
listeners might find interesting. Going back to the FSA, Dorothea Lange's famous image of the migrant mother is supposed to exist in a negative form, even though when you look at the Library of Congress, you only can see the positive form, which I find, right, again, disturbing. But when you look at the negative, you find out that in the positive, there was a thumb that was being removed, right? An actual thumb kind of migrates out of the image because it's distracting. So again, getting used to the idea that negatives exist, that they're part of the story, seeking them, obtaining the resources that are necessary for reading them, it is really central for the ways in which we deal with mis and disinformation in terms of both visual and sound in the age of AI.
Yeah, I see. As you're describing the way negatives reveal manipulation, really clearly see the parallels with algorithmic manipulation or generation of images and sounds and moving images as well.
Absolutely. And it's if we carry this idea, conceptual understanding of positive, negative media, which is what I call the evocation of negative theory, it becomes almost common sense to think about the raw material or the negative when it comes to algorithmic images and algorithmic media, and to think about where this was sourced and what kind of outcome can we expect from a particular source, which is, I think, something that, right, both sound and photography already carry with themselves. It's just AI is very good at trying to hide its negative, and we have to be extra diligent in finding ways to uncover it and, um, being able to read it as well.
Right. And there's the same parallels in the digital space with the light box and
Yes,
magnifying glass
yes,
necessary to read photographic negatives.
absolutely, absolutely, because algorithms are often seen as a black box. So it's often this process of illumination and thinking about media as a process, thinking about media in a historical aspect, thinking through media archaeology is really central to having a critical framework towards technology in the current moment.
Now, that concept of media archaeology, it seems like you're contributing to that. Is that perhaps a recent development in the field of media studies?
It's been articulated by two amazing scholars, Josie Perica and Eric Hetemo, and it has become, I think, increasingly important to our current moment because it speaks to parallel developments and it speaks to trajectories, which are not necessarily coherent, but allows us to trace media development or technology development in a longer historical framework through the use of topoi. And in this case, I'm using negative as a topoi to think about conceptual as well as technological developments within a particular media vein. I think it's central to the importance of preservation as an act that's not just connected to a historical past, but rather is extremely relevant and informs a critical future.
And I suppose that's also where the archive comes in as pardon me, as a source for your research. How do you approach the archive as a media studies scholar?
I think that the understanding archives is central as a way of understanding the transition that we have moved to from databases and the preservation, the curation of the archive, the importance of people like Rolla Wall, who are central and kind of foundational in my understanding and engaging with the collection, who has put so much time and effort in understanding the material properties and the ways in which those images are preserved and can carry a legacy, can carry a story long term, right? Versus the databases that seem to be fleeting, that seem to be producing images and kind of living in a culture in which that history is actively erased as it's being rewritten through technology. So I think that the archives present an antidote to the emergence of database and data bank cultures because of the care, the effort, the understanding that goes into shoring up an archive and its usefulness for critical thinking, where the database kind of operates in trying to obscure human labor, in trying to obscure historical references, and in trying to kind of remain transparent or invisible in the background while pointing attention only to the technologically produced outcome.
Mhm. I wonder if you could tell us about some of the other great images you found in the Hagley archive, maybe some that really made light bulbs go off for you.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the women in the collection. There are quite a bit of women and women's hands holding objects in the RCA collection, and I found that presence kind of interesting, the gendering of the recording industry, the way it was captured, where we have kind of female presence accentuated in moments in which this kind of delicacy or aestheticism is introduced into the image. And those images were created for catalogs, right, that exemplify the technology. So those are your showgirls that show off the technologies at the trade shows. But the images made an attempt to capture and connect the technology to a sense of aesthetic through the use of female hands and beautiful, kind of well-stylized women.
Well, Stefka, it's such a rich study, and I want to thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Absolutely. I cannot speak highly enough of the Hagley and this particular collection, as well as of Laura's extremely helpful and knowledgeable kind of resource and guide that's available in this place. So I'm really excited to return and to continue my work. But thank you for having me. It was absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you for saying so. You're very welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.